Every nation except Qatar took part in the airstrikes. Well, the airstrikes come at a time when the world's leaders are gathering at the United Nations in New York. CCTV's Nathan King is there. Nathan, we've heard from several leaders, including the Secretary General himself.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the timing of these strikes just comes as 140 world leaders come to the 69th UN General Assembly. And remember, this whole day was really meant to be about climate change and the summit. But the UN Secretary General found that he had to really answer questions about his stance on the US-led strikes over Syria. It was meant to be the day when the temperature of the planet took center stage at the UN, but instead it was the US-led airstrikes against so-called Islamic State and other terrorists that the UN chief had to address first.
In the case of Syria, there can be no genuine protection if extremist groups are permitted to act with impunity and if the Syrian government continues to commit gross human rights violations against its own citizens. Protecting the Syrian people requires immediate action, but action that is rooted in the principles of the United Nations.
The UN Secretary General indicating tacit approval for the strikes, and then this statement from the Syrian president. Syria will continue to resolutely fight the war it has been prosecuting for years against terrorism. It supports any international effort to fight against terrorism. That mild statement acknowledging that even though the US has called for Bashar al-Assad to step down, both Damascus and Washington share a common enemy in northern Syria that they both label as terrorist. Iran's president arriving in New York called US policy over Syria confusing and called the strikes illegal, as the US did not get Syria's permission to strike its sovereign territory. The US, however, did warn Syria that it was about to strike. US Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power informed her Syrian counterpart Bashar al-Jafari. The State Department said the US did not provide details of the strikes and warned Syria not to engage US aircraft. And they stressed there was no coordination with the Syrian government. The fact that the US chose not to come to the United Nations to get some authorization from the Security Council before these strikes is telling. They probably thought that they may not be able to get a resolution through, but in a letter to the Security Council from the US Ambassador Samantha Power, she basically says that they have the authority to strike because they are requested to protect Iraq, and then of course Islamic State are based in Syria as well, and that also Al-Qaeda affiliated groups are operating in Syria as well. So obviously a lot of attention on these strikes, and there'll be a lot of debate about the timing, the perhaps legitimacy as well. But they did overshadow the climate conference that was the centerpiece of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And I'd like